So the fossils we're going to talk about are mostly, almost all, going to be fossils of animals. Just because I don't know very much about fossils of plants, they're interesting, but you got to limit yourself. So before we can talk about fossils of animals, it's probably a good idea to talk about animals in general and like what kinds of them and what are the sort of defining features, like what are their characteristics. And our mascot for today is a little trilobite from a 2024 paper Moroccan trilobites, and they call them like trilobite mummies. They're really cool, and they just preserve all the details in a way that has never been done before. They're super neat. Yeah, anyway, let's get started. So these are some of the big groups of animals right here. And so these are going to be some of their names. We're going to study sponges. That's the porifera, cnidaria. The C is silent. Those are going to be things like corals and jellyfish and sea anemones. Nematoda are these little skinny worms, and they got weird mouths. If I remember right, sometimes they're like three-sided mouths, like the worm from Dune, but itty bitty, not giant, like you can ride on it. Mollusks are a lot of different things. So they're snails, and they're things like clams, and they're things like octopus and squids, stuff like that. Chambered nautilus, yeah. And a bunch of other stuff that you've probably never heard of unless you've taken an invertebrate zoology class. And we'll get to that when we get there. It'll be fine. Bryozoa are called moss animals. They are animals. They are not moss-like at all, but they either grow as a little hard sort of crust on other things, or they're sort of like a jelly-like blob. But they're really interesting. They're relatives of these things called brachiopods, whose name is stupid. Brachy is like arm, and pod means foot. Arm foot? Yeah, who's even thinking of this stuff? Those are my favorite. We'll get to them. We're going to do a lot of stuff on them later. Arthropods are going to be things with jointed legs and like an exoskeleton. So arthropods are part of a group that's going to have to shed its skeleton as it gets bigger. And so that's things that are not like us, but things that are like a crab or are like an insect, are like a trilobite. And there's some kinds of worms, preapulid worms, for example, that also do this skin shedding sort of thing. We'll get there. Echinoderms are going to be stuff like a sea urchin or a sea star, like starfish. Or there's the older version, is called crinoids, and they still exist. There aren't that many of them. They're really cool, and they are probably the commonest fossil from the Paleozoic, which is where we're going to go collect, that you will find. So you will get well familiar with crinoids, or at least with their stems, because there's a lot of stem segments. These things were really long. They kind of looked like a flower. That's what the name means, but they're animals. All these things on this list are animals. So even like a sponge, yeah, is a sponge animal made of meat. Yeah, the thing that you soap up with at night. That's the skeleton of the sponge after you boil off the flesh. You monster. Yeah, also corals are like, oh, they're a little bit photosynthetic. No, they're animals, and they happen to trap little things to do photosynthesis for them, but they are animals, just like you and me. And then the last group are just like you and me. That's the chordates, chordata, cord havers. Yeah. And the cord is your spinal cord. So there we go. All right. So if you need to come back to it, here's a little list. Now, we said that this sort of spinal cord, so the fancy name for that, the front of me is my ventral side, the back of me is my dorsal side, and so we have a dorsal nerve cord. And so let's find us on this list. Do 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 do. Somewhere in here. Oh, did they leave us off the list? Yeah, maybe. Looks like they did. Hey, whatever. That's fine. Yeah, it doesn't hurt my feelings. Most of the things we're going to cover are going to be invertebrate, which is honestly one of the dumber words that's going to come out of my mouth in this class. Because vertebrate means like this tiny little slice of all the animals, and you throw away everything that doesn't have a dorsal nerve cord, and then you throw away everything where the dorsal nerve cord isn't supported by a little rod of like gristle or bone. And then you throw away all of those pretty much. Actually, no, you keep most of those. Yeah, because those are. But there's also some embryonic characteristics that they have. We'll get into in a sec. But you can see right here, dorsal nerve cords actually show up here and there in a lot of different groups. So they're the defining feature of animals like us. And vertebrates are chordates, like cord havers, but with bones essentially underneath them. And it's just like the tiniest sliver of a sliver. And so then you say invertebrate. Well, that's literally every other animal. So congratulations. That's the everything else word. Yeah. If it's a pie chart, vertebrates are, you can't even see them. It's too thin a slice. The rest of the pie is invertebrate. So that's why we study most of them, because they're really interesting and weird looking. And they're the things that people don't usually know as much about outside the class. But boy, are you going to learn a lot about them. All right. If you're interested. So you have actually a couple of genomes in your body. You have your nuclear genome, which is all the genes that you inherit from mom and dad, all mixed together, all those chromosomes that got mixed around when you were fertilized. And you have a mitochondrial genome. So each of your little mitochondria, I'm not going to say what they are, but it's of the cell and it has something to do with power. Yeah, because also that's dumb. But those are basically enslaved bacteria from way back when. And when we enslaved them, they had their own genes, and they still do have their own little genomes that make a couple of genes at least. But it's really variable. And so you'd say, well, how can you be a mitochondrion and have, be 10,000 bases long or be 50,000 bases long? That seems like a lot. How can you have none of your own tRNA genes? You need those to stay alive. Or like a pretty much full set of tRNA genes. How can all these things be possible? And the answer is that eukaryotes, things with a nucleus, like us, have been stealing from the mitochondria. So not only did they get sort of trapped inside of our cells and they can't leave, we actually took away a bunch of their genome and put it into the nucleus genome so that now these little bacteria things that are running around our cells are basically under our genetic control. Because a lot of the genes that they require to stay alive are only expressed from the nucleus. It's as if you had to go to a special office and file a registration to get the air you breathe every day. It's kind of like that. All right, so here's a little thing. These are some more of the groups that we're going to cover. I think let's see. Yeah, I don't remember why I put some of these in bold, but so we got a couple of groups down here that are different groups of sponges, like Calcaria and hexactinellids and demosponges, and then coniflagellates are neat little things. This is fairly comprehensive. Actually, I think I remember why. All the things that are in black have a section in this course. So there's at least one lecture just about them. And some of these things, like mollusks, get a few lectures. Some of these things, like brachiopods, get a few lectures, but you wish there were more, I bet. You will, yeah. All right, so let's look at the big, 7, 8, 9, something like that. Animal phyla. What's their defining feature? So start with sponges. Sponges are easy. Squishy thing, sure, but when it's alive, it's a little meat animal. It's going to be a water filtering machine, and sponges are going to pull water in from the side, filter out all the little bits of anything to eat, and sponges do not care. They will eat anything. They are carnivore, they are omnivore, they are herbivore. If it's in the water, they will usually gobble it up, and they don't seem to care very much for the most part. They're going to then pump all the used water into a central chamber, and it's going to go out the top like a little chimney. So when you see a sponge, it's going to have a central hole at the top. The fancy name for that's an osculum. It's just a fancy word for hole. And there's going to be lots of little pores on the side where the water is going to come in. Those can be called pores, the little tiny ones, or ostia is where they're going to inhale water, is actually what we say. And they're going to do this because inside and in little chambers that are kind of in the meaty part of the sponge, they've got these little collar cells, choanocytes is the fancy name, and they've just got a little whip and they rotate it all sort of, a little bit synced up. And when they're doing that, they're going to generate a water current. And so that's what's going to pull the water in. When you see how much water these things pull in, and they can do it with dyes and show you, it is really impressive. Sponges are very, very active and they clear out the water around them. You don't often see them in aquariums because they're kind of toxic and you've got to feed them enormous amounts of teeny tiny stuff. Uh, and they kind of spread around. There's toxic sometimes. They're neat. Yeah, sponges are doing fine. When coral reefs die, they are currently being replaced by sponges for the most part. Okay, Cnidaria. These are going to have specialized cells that have a little poison tipped harpoon inside. They're called cnidocytes. And that is what jellyfish use to sting you and, more accurately, the fish and things that they're going to eat. These are little spring loaded capsules, these cnidocysts in cnidocytes. And they've got a little, it's like a sort of a barbed hook, and they grow these things out of protein. They have genes to build just the right hook, and they all make slightly different looking hooks. And then they've got a long cord that comes off it, just like the stupid yellow guy in Mortal Kombat. And so they're going to fling this thing out, and it's like a spear on a rope. And it is poison tipped quite often, the spear head. And then the rope is going to be anchored inside so that once this thing is poisoned, it can't get away. And then the rest of the jellyfish or coral, corals eat this way too, is just going to sort of grab around with these muscular little tentacles and cram it into a central opening, which is the mouth. And that's how they eat. It's something else. Yeah. So the stinging little tentacles, that's really what defines Cnidaria now. But also sometimes they make really cool skeletons, like coral reefs are, mostly the skeleton. There's a little bit of organic, like living stuff on the surface. That's the coral animal. But most of the big blob underneath it is just a solid white block of calcite, which is all their old skeletons. So as they grow, they just stack a new layer on top of whatever was there and keep on going. Yeah, they're pretty neat. Annelids, we'll cover them a little bit. It's going to be things like leeches, it's going to be things like earthworms, and it's going to be a whole bunch of sort of feathery looking, spiny looking creatures of the ocean. In the past, they would have called these polychaete worms and thought that word meant anything. It means nothing phylogenetically. Two things on opposite ends of the tree can be called that, and the thing in the middle is called something else. So it's a term with no meaning. One thing that they have is these are basically these little sort of ribs that you can see on here are basically segments. So it's a segmented body. The idea of the segmented body is that each segment has a couple of core functions that run through the center. So when it grows a new segment, it's going to grow a new piece of its circulatory system and a new piece of its digestive system and a new chunk of its nervous system. And it'll just grow all of these together, and that'll be one unit, one little ring of our annelid. And so here you can see some of the, it's like multiple hearts, but really they're just like sort of expanded blood vessels that are going to all beat, and those are going to be what moves the blood around the rest of the organism. Okay, mollusks. This doesn't look like a very good mollusk. This is like a reconstruction of the first mollusk. So the really early ones we think were sort of dome-shaped things, kind of like a limpet. If you've ever been to the beach, they're the ones that are like a little circus tent, and they stick themselves down onto a rock. Those approximate kind of the shape and vibe, if you will, of what mollusks started out as, but then they turn into crazy, like intelligent, possibly malevolent things like squids and octopus. Yeah, that are able to solve puzzles and open doors and just do all sorts of stuff. Yeah, and also clams. Yeah, which are more interesting than you'd think. Yeah. Arthropods, skeleton on the outside, and just sort of blood pumping around on the inside. Here's the little nerve cord, and you can see it's going to run down here on the bottom side of them. Yeah, so it's going to be stuff like an insect or like a crab or like a lobster. Those would be very good arthropods. and a whole bunch of other things. Things like spiders are definitely arthropods. Stuff that's hard on the outside and soft on the inside. Delicious. Echinoderms thing. So, backing up, arthropods, one of their things is that they have this exoskeleton, and it's made, you probably remember from like elementary school, it's got chitin in it, right? This mysterious substance. That's true. But particularly in the older ones, it's chitin and it's reinforced with a lot of minerals. So it's like a hardened version that's got stuff like iron built into it in a lot of these cases. So yeah, it's hard to crack some of these giant crab shells for a reason. You know, they work hard at that. Yeah, but very soft and flaky on the inside, at least after you cook them. Echinoderms, it means like spiny skin. That's their name. These things have a couple different circulatory systems. So they have one for the equivalent of like their blood. They've got digestive tracts that are running around here. But they also have a thing called a water vascular system, which is water that they pump around, and they're going to use it to do hydraulic things. Like you're thinking hydraulics? Like, yeah, hydraulics. Like where if you have a water balloon that's halfway full and you squeeze one half, what happens to the other half? It inflates, right? Or like an air balloon would do that as well. Yeah, but we're talking hydraulics. This is happening with water. Creatures like this are going to have these weird little contraptions called tube feet, and they look like a little suction cup, and they are hydraulic. So when there's a little chamber at the bottom, and if it pulls all the water out of that tube foot, then the tube foot sort of shrivels and it doesn't really do anything. It's limp. Yeah, limp and itty bitty. And if that squeezes, then it's going to fill up the tube foot and it's going to stick onto something. And it's not just like the, stick and no stick. They can do this in conjunction with some muscles that are moving the arms around, for example, or moving little spines around on the surface. And these things can walk, they can hold themselves in different shapes. They are really neat, and their ancient ancestors were super interesting as well. Now, the other big thing about echinoderms is not their skin. We named them after their bumpy skin. Irrelevant. The thing that they have is a mesodermal skeleton. What's that? It's a skeleton that's not on the outside and not all the way on the inside. It's, just up under the surface, like our skeleton. Yeah. Which you'd think like your arm, yeah, all right, that's there. But if you think about your rib cage, that's a better example. And you've got a clear sort of layer of bones. They're like the middle layer. And all your important stuff, like your organs, is inside, or are inside. And so that's the way those work. And so those leave good fossils when they do, but they have so many little tiny bones that they tend to break apart sometimes. And then you get our group. We're going to have these, frankly, rather ill-defined little things. So we're going to have a nerve cord that's running down our backs. Like, okay, but this is soft tissue. When it fossilizes, you may not be able to see it anymore unless there is exceptional preservation that just happens to capture this. We've got a notochord, which doesn't have to be mineralized, and so if it's just cartilage, often that doesn't fossilize. So awesome, we're 2 out of 2 in things that won't show up on the fossil record reproducibly. Next, you have a pharynx with little pharyngeal slits, and if you're checking your neck thinking, no, don't have that, you did when you were a baby. You were a little tiny fish baby, and there's your little pharyngeal gill slits. And a lot of the other chordates would still have this even in the adult form. But once again, that's soft tissue and you're not going to find it. Endostyle, sure. It's a little sort of tentacle groove mouth thing for picking up little bits of food and stuffing them in. And if you're feeling around inside your mouth, no, it's not there anymore. Not really, although the little microvilli in your throat, I believe, are derived from that. I think that's right. Not microvilli. Little cilia. Sorry. Yeah, ciliated cells. The little things that are, moving stuff around. The things that are moving mucus around so you can clear your throat. Yeah, I won't do it for you, but yeah, that's part of their purpose. And so that's an endostyle, which once again is both microscopic and soft tissue only, and we never find those in the fossil record. And the last thing is a post-anal tail. So you have to be able to find the anus, which is soft, and then there has to be some amount of tail that goes past it. And if you're feeling around your backside, Yeah, that's another thing you had as a little tiny, as a little sprout in the first couple of weeks and months in your mother. But we lose it. We atrophy it. What's left of our tail becomes that little coccyx bone, that little sort of triangular thing that's down here. It's called a tailbone sometimes. Um, uh, and so, yeah, that's all that's left. So, the group that we're part of, the chordates, rather tough to diagnose from fossils. And the added bonus is that everybody wants to find chordate fossils because that's our most recent ancestor or earliest ancestor or most interesting ancestor or something like that. When really all the animals are related to each other, not even that distantly related to each other. So it's kind of silly, but yeah, whatever. All right. In addition to those, there are several groups of animals that no longer exist and have left basically no trace. Little hyalithids, tomotids, which are very similar looking on the outside. These things are classified with sponges, but they probably belong as either their own phylum, which is like a really high ranking group of animals, or at least their own class within the sponges. Normally you would figure this out by DNA, but the problem is DNA, theoretical best case, you can get like 6 million years of somewhat readable DNA before it's completely gone. And these things have been dead for about 500 million years. So, yeah, there's just no way. They are gone, and all we've got are questions. Yeah, very few ways to answer them, although there are some. And that's another thing this class is about. It's about ways other than genetics that we can use to figure out how things were related, where we came from, how everything got here. Anyway, back to these. All these big guys are what we call trilobites, and they're fantastic. They are pretty much everybody's favorite invertebrate fossil. It's okay if they're yours. They're a solid choice. And maybe they're mine. I don't know. Yeah, they're not. Brachiopods are. But you've also got these other groups of things. So this is its own phylum, Vetulicolia. And these things are maybe somewhere on the way to becoming chordates, but they only have some of the chordate traits like that we would find in baby humans. And other things maybe don't fossilize, and other things are real hard to see, but they seem kind of chordate ish. Yeah. And then if you go back even further, so those things on the last slide were from the Cambrian, and the Cambrian is like 400 and a bunch million years to 500 and something million years. But most of the really good stuff is around, it's like 512, 513, and a little younger than that. Those are the really well preserved formations where we get a lot of information. Go back further, go back to 540, 560 million years ago, and you find a bunch of stuff like this. It seems to be animal for a bunch of reasons, like it's located too far down in the ocean. You can tell depth from a fossil. For it to have had any real sunlight. So it's not a plant down there, and it does have organization. Some of these things were apparently able to move. We don't know that they moved fast because they would move and they would kind of absorb this sort of slimy bacterial mat that they were on. Really interesting. And then they'd move along and they'd leave sort of a little footprint where they had digested this gross, disgusting bacterial film. And that's what they did for a living. And a bunch of other things that who knows what they are, but seem to be mostly, maybe all early animals. But these things don't fit with any of the current groups, and whatever groups they were in, we could have named them. We still can name them, I guess, but it is really hard to tell whether these two things belong in the same group because they both sort of look like a feather or a leaf, or do they belong in totally different groups because they seem to have different sort of symmetry in them. One has a central stalk. You can make up groupings for all these things, but that does not make them right. That's all I'll say. Yeah. All right. So those are some of the animals. You may want to come back to this and refresh when we hit a new animal group, but you at least have the basics. And now these are the things that are mostly alive. we're going to figure out how we got to these things. And there's some really weird stuff out there. So tune in. Thanks.